For the better part of the 20th century, pilots from all over the world have claimed to have had encounters with strange, unidentified aircraft. And while it can be anything from an awe-inspiring to a frightening experience, for the most part these encounters seem to end with no real damage done. Sometimes these incidents can induce panic with temporary loss of aircraft controls or sometimes near collisions in midair. But planes that have suddenly vanished after such encounters have become a source of some concern. Our story tonight deals with one such incident that occurred off the coast of Australia in the 1970s, and while aviation experts have put forth some very sound theories as to what happened, the case itself remains to this day shrouded in mystery. This is extremely strange. "20-year-old Fred Valentich was an amateur Australian pilot who had totaled around 150 hours of flight time and held a rating of a Class 4, which allowed him to fly at night but only in visual meteorological conditions, which meant the ability to discern landmarks and other aircraft visually. Freddie had twice applied to the Royal Australian Air Force for admittance, but because of inadequate background education was rejected both times. Still, he volunteered to be a non-paid member of the RAAF Air Training Corps, which he hoped would eventually lead to a career in aviation as a commercial pilot. Valentich had previously failed no less than 5 commercial license examination subjects and had been involved in some rather egregious incidents, once flying into controlled airspace over Sydney, and on 2 other occasions deliberately flying into cloud banks, an offense where prosecuting him for the violation was seriously considered. He was fortunate in each case to receive only a letter of reprimand. He still managed to qualify for flying a single-engine Cessna and a certification to transport passengers. While he prepped for yet another run at a commercial license, he built up his flight hour requirements out of Moorabbin Airport in Victoria. Freddie was also known to be a UFO enthusiast. He believed strongly in their existence and, according to his father, Guido, had expressed concern about confronting or possibly being attacked by one while in flight. On the night of October 21st, 1978, he was flying a Cessna 182L over the Bass Strait, which separates Tasmania from the Australian mainland. His destination was King Island, where he was to meet friends and engage in a seafood dinner on the shore. He had not informed the King Island Airport of his intention to fly there, which is standard procedure. His plane departed Moorabbin Airport at 6:19 p.m. Now, the Bass Strait is notorious for some very challenging weather conditions, but on this night the weather was clear, the wind was calm. Perfect conditions for flying. At 7:06 p.m., he radioed the Melbourne Air Traffic Control Tower to report visually spotting an unidentified object trailing him at his altitude of 4,500 feet. The tower confirmed they saw no traffic on radar, but Valentich nonetheless described the craft passing by him at around 1,000 feet above his plane at a high rate of speed. The craft displayed what appeared to be 4 very bright landing lights. Valentich then radioed that, quote, "It's approaching right now from due east toward me. It seems to me that he's playing some sort of game." Soon he reported the vehicle to be stationary and then circling above him, and he described it as appearing metallic with a shiny surface with a green light emitting from it. At this point, things took an even more dramatic turn, as Freddie reported experiencing problems with his plane's engine. When asked to possibly identify the unknown craft in question, he replied, "It's not an aircraft." In the final 17 seconds of his transmissions with the tower, Fred described hearing an odd metallic scraping noise before he lost contact at 7:12 p.m. What you're about to hear is the actual recording of those sounds. When his plane failed to land at King Island, the worst was assumed, and an air and sea rescue mission was initiated with vessels, both private and commercial, assisting the search on water, with an RAAF Lockheed P-3 Orion and 8 civilian aircraft doing the same from the air. Over 1,000 square miles were searched, but no trace of Valentich's plane was found. 4 days later, with no results, the official search was called off. Undaunted, volunteers and friends of Fred's continued the search by air and land, with many feeling that since no wreckage had been found, it was thought he perhaps reversed his heading and crash-landed somewhere in the forests of Cape Otway Peninsula. A group of his air training buddies spent a number of days there, doing flyovers and ground searches, but still no sign of Fred or his plane. The Australian Department of Transport, Australia's version of the FAA, launched an official inquiry into the plane's disappearance, but was unable to find anything definitive as to its cause. Lacking any physical evidence confirming a crash, they nonetheless presumed a fatality had occurred, and for all intents and purposes, Freddie Valentich was declared legally dead. The department, knowing the conversation between Fred and the tower was overheard on many amateur radios, released a partial transcript of the conversation, and because Fred claimed to have witnessed unidentified aerial phenomenon before he vanished, the disappearance became front-page news, and the media sought out interviews with all involved. Some 5 years after his aircraft went missing, an engine cowl flap was found washed ashore on Flinders Island. The Royal Australian Navy Research Laboratory was asked about the possibility of the object having been carried there by ocean currents from the spot where contact with the pilot was lost. It was confirmed that the part was indeed from a Cessna 182, and its serial numbers were in the range of issuance, which would include the one Valentich was flying that night. But before it could be tested by more modern scientific processes, it was discovered the Department of Aviation could not locate it. It had simply gone missing. In the 44 years since 20-year-old Freddie Valentich went missing, his disappearance remains one of the most controversial on record. And as you can probably guess, the details surrounding this case have polarized the aviation, scientific, and paranormal communities like so many others have in the past. Let's take a look into some of the various explanations as to why the aircraft piloted by Fred Valentich went missing in October of 1978. The first theory is that Valentich may have staged his own disappearance. There are two things that factor into this. One is that the Cessna certainly had enough fuel to make the round trip, so running out of gas didn't seem like a viable explanation. Secondly, his aircraft was never seen on radar, casting doubt as to whether he was anywhere near the actual location he was heading to. And lastly, police in Melbourne received multiple reports of a light plane landing not far from his alleged location at the same time he disappeared. Now, this doesn't make a lot of sense unless he's living the life of a castaway somewhere on a deserted island. And there was nothing in his life that he was seemingly trying to escape or run away from. Suicide was also mentioned as an alternative explanation, but those closest to Valentich, including doctors and many colleagues, quickly dismissed that as a possibility, given his overall optimistic state of mind. In fact, he had planned to become engaged to his then-girlfriend, so it appeared he had already set a course for his own future. However, what led up to that theory being put forth actually began 3 months earlier. In July of 1978, Freddie had taken 2 of his 5 CPL examinations for the 3rd time and, joined by his girlfriend, had gone to the home of his mentor and ATC squadron leader Edwin Barnes, bearing 2 bottles of wine to celebrate what he believed was a successful passing of the tests. Barnes declined, telling Freddie he was currently on duty, but that he would share a drink when he received the official word he had passed. In September, Barnes received a call from Freddie, who said he had passed all 5 of his CPL examinations. But in truth, he had failed 3 of them for the 3rd time and did not bother taking the other 2, which Barnes only discovered after Fred's disappearance. When the Air Safety Investigation Branch of the Department of Transport requested a character profile for Freddie, Barnes expressed in writing his deep disappointment at being lied to and expressed concern that this last failure might have contributed to his disappearance. Based on Fred's unusual claim of contact with a UFO, coupled with the relatively calm demeanor he displayed in reporting it to the tower, along with the absence of a flight plan, Barnes wrote, quote, "I am now asking myself if he has absconded with the aircraft or if it was a suicide flight that he had carefully planned for some time." The most common theory put forth by aviation specialists is that essentially Valentich became disoriented and was, in actuality, at some point flying his plane upside down, and as a result crashed into the sea. As an inexperienced pilot, he may have become confused by the illusion of a false horizon, basically not recognizing visual landmarks and losing perspective on where he was. This could have happened while guiding his plane into banking turns. In compensating for this loss of visual perspective, he may have put his plane into a dangerous corkscrew drive, known in aerial terms as the graveyard spiral. The lights he associated with the unknown aircraft may actually have been those of his own, reflected in the water below, and the G-forces placed on the light Cessna would dramatically reduce its fuel flow, causing the rough idling of the engine that he reported. The lights he saw were also suggested to have possibly been the planets Venus, Mercury, and Mars, as well as the star Antares, which was confirmed by a computer search of the astronomical conditions that night. With his significant interest in UFOs, it might be assumed his mind immediately projected what he was seeing as otherworldly and a potential threat to him. In the ensuing panic, he simply lost his bearings. Then there is the Bass Strait itself, which, as mentioned earlier, has achieved a well-earned reputation as not the most accommodating of places for aerial and sea navigation. Winds typically come out of the west, and the location of King Island at its western entrance often result in some very unpredictable weather conditions during the stronger winds that arise. These winds, coupled with active currents, tides, and the relatively shallow bottom of the strait, can result in some brief but formidable waves, making nautical travel hazardous. At least 13 ships have simply vanished there, and hundreds have run aground by hitting coral reefs or river bars, dating all the way back to the late 1700s. Winds and dramatic changes in weather conditions can also wreak havoc with air travel as well. Beyond Freddie Valentich's Cessna, the list of disappearances or crashes includes the de Havilland Express Miss Hobart in 1934, the Holloman Loina, an airliner with 5 people aboard in 1935. Several aircraft, including a number of RAAF bombers, were lost on a training mission during the Second World War. A de Havilland Tiger Moth with 2 passengers aboard, and perhaps Freddie Valentich found himself caught in a drastically changing weather environment, and his inexperience and smaller plane led to his tragic demise. Now let's get down to what has made this case so fascinating in the 40-plus years since Fred's disappearance. Whether a UFO was responsible for the disappearance of both Valentich and his aircraft. Freddie was dating 16-year-old Rhonda Rushton. She flew with him a number of times and in fact was with him on that illegal flight into restricted airspace over Sydney. She recalled the agitated and anxious manner he displayed when doing so, clearly recognizing his mistake. This occurred 2 months before his disappearance. In her interview with investigators, who were interested in gaining insight into his state of mind, she described him as, quote, very sober, not prone to drinking, and with an overall sincere manner about him. But she also discussed his mindset on the topic of UFOs. She claimed that a week before the incident, they had driven to the Dandenong Ranges east of Melbourne. There they got onto the topic of UFOs, with Fred saying that if one were to land right in front of him, he would definitely want to go inside, but only with her along. When asked about the level of his interest, she said they would discuss them only on occasion, and in her mind, his interests mirrored that of the average person. Rhonda also told the investigator that Fred kept newspaper clippings of UFO reports as a hobby, but years later, at an anniversary event commemorating the incident, she denied ever saying that. Fred's father, Guido Valentich, was also spoken to by the Department of Transport on October 25th, the day after Rhonda's interview. He revealed that Fred was a firm believer in UFOs and had read Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Däniken, which posits that technological advances by ancient civilizations were made with the aid of extraterrestrial beings. Guido also claimed Fred told him that on a recent camping trip with members of the Air Training Corps, he was allowed to see classified files on UFOs kept by the RAAF. He claimed he could not reveal what he learned as he felt a duty to keep them under wraps. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Fred was obviously a young man that wanted to make something out of his life, and the setbacks he encountered along the way no doubt weighed heavily on him. He seemed like a young guy who just wanted to feel a sense of pride and importance, and not wanting to let anyone down or have that shame cast upon him. It wasn't out of the possibility that he would embellish or perhaps even fabricate things from time to time. So it's not surprising then that people who perhaps thought he was less than credible would project that on this particular incident. Nonetheless, his father also recalled that his wife Alberta had recently seen a UFO, and when she called Fred to discuss it, he claimed he had seen it as well. It was described as a large light that remained stationary until it moved off at tremendous speed. Guido found this account quite compelling and himself came to believe that Earth was being visited by extraterrestrial beings. Fred had confided to his father he was concerned about what an alien attack would mean to civilization, but Guido told him if it came to that, there was nothing that could be done, so why worry about it? By October 23rd, the Bendigo Advertiser ran a story titled UFO Took Our Boy, which featured an interview with Guido and Alberta Valentich, in which the understandably emotional parents disputed any notion of their son's failure to control his aircraft and expressed the idea that the Department of Transportation was covering up something more sinister. Days after the disappearance, a letter to the editor of the Kings Island News, written by a woman a month earlier, was resurrected. In it she claimed, quote, "We saw our first sighting 2 months ago. We were driving into Curry and a slow-moving light followed us down the North Road and finally disappeared toward the lighthouse. There were other sightings in Curry on the same night. Some people further up north also saw a strange light passing over their house. Then another told of seeing beautiful strange lights outside, one going out to investigate the lights that suddenly disappeared. Then last night, the strange light appeared again just up from Camp Creek. On each of these occasions, the light has been very large and bright and seems to light up the area as if it were daylight," end quote. Soon other stories of aerial sightings emerged. On October 23rd, a man named John Snow contacted the DOT and claimed that on the night of Fred's disappearance, His 11-year-old son saw a streak of green light move across the sky about 70 miles from Cape Otway. Mr. P. Farr, an officer in the RAAF Reserve, contacted officials to tell them of a sighting he had that same night, where he witnessed a shower of very bright metallic scintillions to the south, high in the sky, about 30 bright centers. The Australian published an article detailing a sighting by Wayne Bellew, a technician who worked with the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, and his wife, who both saw a UFO while camping at Bateman's Bay in New South Wales that night. He described seeing, quote, a bright white object performing wild stunts over the ocean. The thing was performing such incredible maneuvers that any conventional pilot who tried it would have been guts over kneecaps, end quote. One witness actually photographed an object he claims shot up out of the water at tremendous speed near Cape Otway Lighthouse. This event occurred only 21 minutes before Valentich first reported the object. Now, on the surface, these reports seem to lend some credibility to Fred's claims, but there was even more to come. One particularly notable sighting came from Mr. and Mrs. Donald Cox from the town of Valley View, which they detailed in a letter sent to the RAAF. While in their garden, they witnessed a bright and shiny object in the sky. Don went in to get his binoculars and through them saw a large triangular object emitting yellow and white light that seemed to be lying on its side, with one edge of it in a vertical position. There were iridescent lights of blue, green, and orange within the object. His wife looked on for around 10 minutes, while Don remained observing it for a total of 45 minutes until it moved off and became hidden behind a tree. He claimed the object morphed into what resembled a V before it moved off. 1 week after the disappearance, the same air traffic controller during the Valentich incident, Steve Roby, told of an incident near Sale in Gippsland. A pilot radioed in to report a visual sighting of a bright light on the horizon moving from west to east. A few minutes later, the same pilot called in to report the same thing occurring, this time vowing to land the plane if he saw it again. It did happen again, and true to his word, the plane was landed out of a fear of interaction with the object. Roby contacted uniformed military personnel, as controllers had now been instructed to do, and later gave a statement to a responding officer. In January of 1979, Fred's father Guido requested the audio recordings of his son's conversation with Steve Roby in the tower that night be released publicly. Claiming their policy was not to release tapes of incidents that were still under investigation, they refused to do so until Guido contacted American UFO researcher Paul Norman. Both Norman and his Australian counterpart, John O'Kettle, negotiated on the Valentich's behalf, and a compromise was reached where an edited 6-minute version would be given to the family, but it would not include either Steve Roby's voice or the first 4 minutes of the conversation. Guido would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement stating he would not release the audio tape to the media and that it was only to be played for family members. Now, this obviously didn't satisfy Norman or O'Kettle, but it did open the door for a lot of frauds and charlatans to come along and capitalize on the idea that a UFO was responsible for this. A self-proclaimed clairvoyant from New Zealand named Colin Amory claimed to have conducted a seance in which he contacted Fred, who told him that he had been taken to a community somewhere in space and that the plane no longer existed in the physical world. Fred would go on to say, through Amory, he was aware that the tape of his interaction with the tower had been edited and suppressed, but that he was safe and now existed in the form of light that can travel wherever he so pleases. Unsurprisingly at that time, Amory was promoting a book called New Atlantis, The Secret of the Sphinx, which detailed the new golden age of Aquarius to come. In October that same year, Michael Fields, who wrote for Ideal UFO Quarterly here in the States, published a false claim that he had come into possession of the entire transcript of Fred's conversation with Steve Roby. The version he submitted was interspersed with some of the actual transcript, which was designed to lend it credibility, but included fabricated details, like Fred describing the object as being 100 feet long, emitting a green gas, and as the metallic sounds were heard at the end, Fred claiming he was experiencing searing pain. In December 1982, Guido Valentich was contacted by a filmmaker by the name of Ron Cameron. He told Mr. Valentich that two divers informed him they had located 3 or 4 aircraft wrecks off Cape Otway, and that identified one as Fred's Cessna 182L. Cameron said that the divers wanted $10,000 to disclose the location of Fred's plane. Cameron further claimed he saw underwater photographs taken of the planes and felt one bore the markings of Fred's, but photographs of the cockpit didn't reveal a body inside. Cameron further claimed he wanted to make a documentary of the discovery and fund a salvage operation. Unfortunately for Cameron, the Bureau of Air Safety came out against any disturbance of possible evidence in the case and would have to be present for any operation that was conducted. Meanwhile, Guido Valentich became very upset at what he perceived to be a cash grab by the divers and Cameron at his son's expense. So in the end, the documentary was never made and the salvage operation was scrapped when the credibility of the divers came into question. But there was one final report that came along that would further plunge Fred Valentich's disappearance into even deeper mystery. In 1998, UFO expert Paul Norman claimed an anonymous man had come forward with a remarkable story of what he had witnessed on the night Fred and his plane vanished. While driving at dusk with 2 nieces on Great Ocean Road at Barham River, they pulled over to watch what he described as a Cessna airplane descending from the sky. He noticed the plane's white and red lights, as well as a circular green light flying above and slightly to the rear of the plane. They continued to watch the scene unfold until both the plane and the unidentified craft disappeared from view, where they assumed they had gone down into the water just off the coast of Apollo Bay. Norman and another UFO researcher, Richard Haynes, surmised that Valentich changed course upon encountering the UFO and indeed had become disoriented, turning away from King Island back toward Victoria. At that point, they surmised that Fred did a complete 360-degree turn and continued flying toward the coast. At this point, they suggested, the engine began to sputter as the plane lost altitude and air-to-ground transmissions went offline. The point where it descended would line up with the time that the gentleman and his nieces spotted the craft just before it splashed down in the bay at roughly 7:21 p.m. Despite their urgings to do so, no search to date has been conducted in this area. Currently, Fred Valentich is still listed as a missing person, with no definitive answer as to what happened to him that night. In 2000, Guido Valentich passed away, never knowing what happened to his son off the coast of Tasmania in 1978. His mother Alberta, his brother Ricky, and his sisters Laura and Olivia still make the trek every year to Cape Otway in remembrance of him, and steadfastly refuse to give up trying to find out what happened to him. And 44 years later, they still cling to the hope that some definitive proof will come to light that will reveal his ultimate fate.